The massive male cougar approached Ranger Marcus Reed, who was tied securely to a towering ponderosa pine on the remote mountainside of Yellowstone National Park. Marcus had been bound and abandoned by poachers, his body aching and hope nearly lost. The rough nylon rope bit deep into his arms and chest, anchoring him immovably against the harsh bark. The enormous male cougar stopped just yards away, its piercing amber eyes locked on him. The crisp autumn air thrummed with a dangerous silence, broken only by the distant call of a raven and the whisper of wind through the evergreens. Marcus tried to control the frantic beat of his heart, searched the male cougar's intimidating frame for any sign of recognition. The animal was magnificent, easily 160 pounds of pure muscle and sinew, its tawny coat gleaming in the early morning light that filtered through the canopy above. That's when he saw it, the faint, jagged scar along its right shoulder blade, a wound he had surgically repaired and sutured 18 months before in the park's wildlife rehabilitation center. It had been a young cougar barely past cub stage, brought in by a concerned hiker named Sarah Chen, who had found the animal bleeding and terrified near Lamar Valley. Marcus had worked through the night alongside Sarah, a visiting veterinarian from Bozeman, carefully extracting the poacher's bullet fragment and closing the wound with meticulous stitches. The young cougar had survived, thrived even, and been released back into the wild after weeks of careful monitoring. But this was clearly that same animal, now fully grown, the magnificent male cougar who had once looked at Marcus with pain and fear in those same amber eyes. The terrifying predator was now his only hope. The male cougar shifted its weight, its gaze moving from Marcus's face to the restricting knots around his torso. It lowered its immense head, the muscles in its powerful neck rippling beneath the fur. A low rumble vibrated in its chest, a sound Marcus knew wasn't aggression, but something like acknowledgement, perhaps even curiosity. The male cougar cautiously extended its snout and nudged the rope, then retracted its head, almost as if assessing the complexity of the knots. Marcus tried to speak, a raw, dehydrated croak leaving his throat after hours of silence. "It's me, big guy. It's Marcus. You remember?" The male cougar flicked its rounded ear, a small sign that it was listening, that some deep instinct or memory was stirring within its wild mind. It then began to work with a precision that belied its predatory nature. The male cougar used its sharp incisors to pull at the thicker strands of the nylon rope, careful to avoid Marcus's exposed skin. Progress was painstakingly slow. The knots were tight and damp with morning dew, the rope designed for securing loads on trucks, not for easy release. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with profound anxiety. If the male cougar accidentally bit him, the relief would be instantly replaced by a catastrophic wound. Those jaws could crush bone, but the animal worked with almost surgical focus, its prior experience with the human's healing hands seemingly translating into a deep, unwavering trust in this mission. The male cougar would pause occasionally, tilting its head to examine the rope from different angles, its whiskers twitching as it assessed the texture and tension. Marcus couldn't help but marvel at the intelligence displayed before him. This wasn't just instinct, this was problem-solving, recognition, perhaps even gratitude manifesting in the most unlikely of ways. The sun continued its slow climb above the jagged peaks of the Absaroka Range, casting long shadows across the mountainside. Marcus's mind drifted back to that night 18 months ago. He remembered the young cougar's labored breathing, the way its body had trembled on the examination table, the trust that had slowly built as Marcus spoke in low, soothing tones, while Sarah prepared the surgical instrument. He remembered releasing the animal weeks later, watching it disappear into the forest with a mixture of pride and melancholy, wondering if it would survive, if the lessons of caution would keep it away from human conflict. Now bound to this tree by men who cared nothing for the sacred balance of this wilderness, Marcus was witnessing the answer to that question. The male cougar remembered. It understood, on some profound level that transcended species, that this human had meant no harm, had offered help when help was desperately needed. Suddenly, a cacophony of howls cut through the quiet mountain morning. In the distance, between two clusters of scattered lodgepole pines, a menacing pack of gray wolves appeared. Their lean, powerful bodies moved with coordinated predatory intent, drawn by the scent of a stationary human and a focused cougar. Marcus's blood ran cold. Wolves in Yellowstone were protected, magnificent creatures that had been reintroduced decades ago to restore ecological balance. But they were also apex predators, opportunistic and fearless when they sensed vulnerability. The male cougar immediately stopped its rescue effort. It raised its head, turning its focus from the knots to the approaching danger. The lead wolf of the pack, a massive gray male with darker guard hairs along its spine, trotted forward aggressively, head low, eyes fixed. The other wolves, 5 in total, spread out in a practiced formation. The male cougar was forced to make a desperate choice: continue trying to save Marcus, or defend both of them from the growing threat. The wolves were closing the distance fast, their bodies low to the ground, moving with the fluid phrase of experienced hunters. Marcus could see the calculation happening in the cougar's eyes, could almost feel the animal's internal struggle. But then something shifted. The male cougar positioned itself directly between Marcus and the advancing wolf pack. It unleashed a piercing, guttural snarl that echoed across the mountainside, a sound that spoke of territorial fury and protective instinct. This was not the curious problem solver from moments before, but the fierce predator that ruled these mountains. The wolves hesitated, momentarily surprised by the cougar's aggressive stance. In the complex hierarchy of Yellowstone's predators, cougars and wolves maintained an uneasy coexistence, each respecting the other's strength. But their hunger and the perceived weakness of the tied human quickly overcame their caution. They fanned out wider, their tactic clear: overwhelm the male cougar with numbers and coordinated attacks. What happened next would test every ounce of the cougar's strength and determination. The fight erupted with shocking speed and violence. The lead wolf lunged first, aiming for the cougar's exposed flank, but the male cougar was faster. It pivoted with feline grace, bringing one massive paw around in a devastating arc. The strike connected with the wolf's shoulder, sending the animal tumbling sideways into the underbrush with a yelp of surprise and pain. 2 more wolves attacked simultaneously from opposite sides, the classic pack strategy designed to overwhelm even the most formidable opponent. The male cougar leaped vertically, an explosive jump that carried it above the snapping jaws, then came down on one wolf's back with crushing force. The impact drove the wolf to the ground, and the cougar's jaws found the scruff of its neck, delivering a powerful bite that communicated dominance without killing intent. The wolf scrambled away, whimpering. But the assault was relentless. The remaining wolves pressed their advantage, darting in and out, testing the cougar's defenses. The male cougar moved with breathtaking agility, spinning and striking, using the terrain to its advantage. It backed toward a large boulder, limiting the angles of attack, forcing the wolves to come at it from the front, where its powerful front legs could do the most damage. Marcus watched in stunned horror and awe, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Every strike the male cougar delivered, every dodge and counter launch, was a life-saving action directed not only at the wolf pack, but ultimately toward his safety. Marcus felt a strange, profound guilt wash over him. He was watching his savior fight for its life, totally unable to offer any assistance, his arms still bound tightly to the tree trunk. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. The male cougar managed to drive the wolves back toward a thicket of young aspens, but not without cost. Marcus could see fresh blood matting the cougar's tawny fur along its left flank, a nasty superficial wound where one wolf had managed to connect. The injury only seemed to intensify the cougar's fury. It let out another piercing scream, a sound that sent chills down Marcus's spine and caused the remaining wolves to finally break formation and retreat into the forest, their tails low, recognizing that this meal would cost too much. With the wolves temporarily repelled but still visible in the shadows between the trees, the male cougar slowly returned to Marcus. It was exhausted, its heavy breathing creating small clouds of vapor in the cool mountain air. It nudged Marcus's cheek gently with its bloodied muzzle, then turned its head and looked intensely at the ropes. The animal let out a soft, intentional growl, a sound that shifted in pitch as it looked back at Marcus, and then down at the knots again, as if trying to will Marcus to understand what needed to happen next. It was a plea for a solution, a non-verbal question that transcended language. This cougar was clearly trying to communicate its frustration and its need for a plan. Marcus's mind raced. The wolves could return at any moment, perhaps with reinforcements. He couldn't remain tied to this tree, and the cougar couldn't hold off another sustained attack while simultaneously trying to free him. But was there a way Marcus could help, even with his hands bound? His fingers, though restricted, still had some mobility. He began testing the rope's tension, feeling for any weak points, any section that might have been frayed by the cougar's earlier effort. The urgency of their situation pressed down on him like a physical weight. With the wolf pack temporarily driven off, a momentary fragile peace settled on the mountainside. But the key to Marcus's freedom was still tightly bound to the thick bark of the ponderosa pine. The morning sun had fully risen now, its warmth beginning to chase away the night's chill, but Marcus felt none of it. His entire focus was on survival, on finding a way to help the cougar help him. Marcus, energized by the imminent danger and the cougar's desperate attempt at communication, focused on the knots with renewed intensity. The male cougar had successfully chewed through the outer layers during those precious minutes before the wolves arrived, but the coarse strands were too thick and tight to penetrate without risking serious injury to Marcus's body. Those incisors, designed for tearing flesh, had their limits when it came to synthetic materials. Marcus desperately began scraping the back of his right hand, where the rope was slightly looser, against the rough bark of the ponderosa pine. The tree's distinctive puzzle piece bark, usually a thing of beauty, now became a tool of survival. He did this repeatedly, using every ounce of strength he could muster, trying to fray the nylon fibers down to a thinner, more manageable strand. The bark scraped his skin raw, leaving bloody marks across his knuckles and wrist. But he ignored the pain. Pain was temporary. Death was permanent. When he looked up, the male cougar was watching him with an intense focus, its amber eyes tracking every movement. There was something almost human in that gaze, an understanding that transcended the barrier between species. Marcus strained his neck to nod toward the specific area of rope he'd frayed, then back at the male cougar's mouth. It was a risky, almost impossible communication, but the intelligent eyes of the male cougar seemed to register the instruction. The animal tilted its head, studying the rope with what could only be described as analytical precision. Then, as if reaching a decision, the male cougar lowered its head once more. It took a deep breath, its ribcage expanding, and with a quick, powerful movement, it bit down hard on the weakened section that Marcus had indicated. Snap! The rope gave way with a sound like a gunshot echoing through the forest. Marcus tumbled to the side, his body hitting the carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves with a painful thud that knocked the wind from his lungs. He was free, but weak and disoriented from hours of confinement and restricted blood flow. He immediately scrambled backwards on his hands and knees, trying to create distance between himself and the huge predator, a reflex he couldn't control even though this animal had just saved his life. His rational mind knew the cougar meant no harm, but millions of years of evolution screamed at him to run. But the danger wasn't over, not even close. Just as Marcus was struggling to get to his feet, his legs wobbling beneath him like a newborn fawn's, a different sound reached them. It was a deep, resonant huffing, the unmistakable vocalization of a creature even more formidable than the wolf pack. Around a distant cluster of Douglas firs, a massive grizzly bear emerged from the undergrowth, its enormous bulk moving with deceptive speed. The bear hadn't witnessed the rescue or the fight with the wolves. It had simply been drawn by the scent of blood and the commotion, investigating what might be an easy meal or a threat to its territory. For the grizzly, Marcus was now just another potential food source, and the wounded cougar was competition. The male cougar, despite its exhaustion and injury, turned immediately toward this new arrival. But this time, there was no aggressive charge, no protective roar. The cougar knew, as any animal of Yellowstone knew, that a full-grown grizzly was a threat on an entirely different level. The bear stood on its hind legs, rising to an imposing height of over 7 feet, its massive head swaying as it tested the air with its sensitive nose. It had likely recently emerged from its den after months of hibernation, hungry and irritable. Marcus felt his newly regained freedom turning to ash. He had escaped the ropes only to find himself caught between two of North America's most powerful predators. The male cougar let out a warning hiss, not of attack but of assertion, a sound meant to establish that this territory, this moment, was not the bear's to claim. But would it be enough? The grizzly dropped back to all fours and began moving toward them with deliberate, ground-eating strides, each footfall leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. Marcus's mind was screaming at him to run, but he knew that running from a grizzly was suicide. The bear could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour in short bursts, faster than any human could hope to move, especially in his weakened state. The male cougar positioned itself once again between Marcus and the approaching threat. But this time its body language was different. There was wariness there, calculation, the recognition that this fight would be far more costly than the encounter with the wolves. Marcus could see the animal's muscles tensing, preparing for what might be its final stand. But then something unexpected happened. Marcus, operating on pure instinct and the adrenaline coursing through his veins, grabbed a thick fallen branch from the ground beside him. It was weathered pine, heavy and solid. He raised it above his head and began shouting at the grizzly, his voice raw and primal, making himself as large and loud as possible. He smacked the branch against the ponderosa pine trunk, creating a sharp cracking sound that echoed across the mountainside. The sudden noise and unexpected aggression from the human seemed to give the grizzly pause. It stopped its advance, swaying its massive head from side to side, reassessing the situation. The male cougar, sensing the shift in dynamics, added its own piercing scream to Marcus's, shouting a united front of defiance. For several heart-stopping seconds, the three predators stood in tense tableau: the wounded cougar, the exhausted human, and the hungry bear. Then, as if deciding that this meal came with too much trouble, the grizzly snorted dismissively, dropped its head and began moving away toward the north, disappearing into a dense stand of white bark pines. The threat had passed, but Marcus knew they had been incredibly fortunate. Grizzlies were unpredictable, and this one had simply chosen the path of least resistance. It might not be so accommodating if their paths crossed again. Marcus slowly lowered the branch, his arms trembling from exhaustion and spent adrenaline. He turned to look at the male cougar, which was now sitting on its haunches, its flanks heaving with labored breaths. The wound on its side was bleeding more freely now, the exertion of multiple fights having reopened the injury. Marcus wanted to help, wanted to repay the debt in some tangible way, but he knew that approaching the animal now, even with the best intentions, would be foolish. The cougar had allowed the contact necessary for rescue, but that didn't make it a domesticated creature. It was still wild, still unpredictable, and likely in pain that would make it defensive. The male cougar stood slowly, wincing slightly as weight shifted onto its injured side. It took a few steps toward Marcus, closing the distance until they were separated by less than 6 feet. There was no aggression in its posture, no threat. Instead, there was something else, something Marcus had rarely seen in his years working with wildlife. Acknowledgement, perhaps even a sense of completion. The animal had finished what it came to do. Marcus, acting on emotion rather than logic, slowly extended his hand, palm down, in a gesture of peace and gratitude. The male cougar, with an intelligence that defied easy explanation, lowered its massive head and allowed Marcus to gently touch the space behind its ear, his fingers brushing against the warm fur. For a brief moment, Human and cougar existed in a space beyond predator and prey, beyond wild and civilized. They were simply two beings who had helped each other survive. Then the male cougar pulled back, turned with quiet dignity, and began walking away across the mountainside. It moved with a slight limp, favoring its injured side, but there was grace in every step. Marcus watched until the tawny form disappeared into the forest, swallowed by the shadows and the ancient trees. He stood there for a long moment, his mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. The sun was higher now, warming his face, and the sounds of the forest were returning to normal. The clock's nutcracker called from somewhere above, and the wind rustled through the pines. Marcus finally turned and began making his way down the mountain, following the old game trail he knew would eventually lead him back to the ranger station. His legs were unsteady, his body battered and bleeding from multiple scrapes, and the rope burns that circled his arms and torso. But he was alive. The walk took nearly 2 hours, each step a test of endurance. He passed familiar landmarks: the lightning-scarred Douglas fir, the small spring where elk often congregated, the rock outcropping that overlooked the Lamar Valley. When he finally stumbled into the ranger station clearing, his colleague Ben Morrison rushed out, his face a mask of shock and concern. "Marcus, where the hell have you been? We've had search teams out looking for you since yesterday afternoon when you didn't check in." Marcus collapsed onto the wooden steps of the station, accepting the water bottle Ben thrust into his hands. The cool liquid was like a miracle, soothing his parched throat. "Poachers," Marcus managed to say between gulps. "Caught them setting traps near Slaw Creek. They ambushed me, tied me to a tree up on Specimen Ridge." Ben's expression darkened. "We'll get them." "Did you see which direction they went?" Marcus nodded, providing what details he could remember about the men's appearance and equipment. Within minutes, Ben was on the radio, coordinating with park law enforcement and the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. The poachers wouldn't get far. Yellowstone was a vast wilderness, but it was also closely monitored, and men carrying illegal equipment tended to stand out. As Ben made the calls, Marcus leaned back against the sun-warmed wood of the station wall and closed his eyes. He didn't tell Ben about the cougar. Not yet. How could he explain what had happened? How could he make anyone believe that a wild mountain lion had recognized him, freed him, and fought off both wolves and a grizzly to protect him? It sounded like a fantasy, the kind of story told around campfires to entertain tourists. But Marcus knew the truth. He had the rope burns and the scratches and the memories burned into his consciousness. That evening, after being checked by the park medic and giving a full statement to law enforcement, Marcus sat alone on the porch of his small cabin near Mammoth Hot Spring. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He thought about the male cougar, wondered if it had found a safe place to rest, if its wound would heal without infection. He thought about Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who had helped save that young cougar's life 18 months ago. He would call her tomorrow, tell her what had happened, share the extraordinary outcome of their compassionate work. 3 days later, word came through the ranger network that the poachers had been apprehended near the northeast entrance of the park. They had been caught with illegal traps, firearms, and evidence linking them to the deaths of several protected animals, including a female grizzly. They would face significant federal charges, fines, and likely prison time. Justice in this case had been swift. But for Marcus, the real story wasn't about the poachers or their capture. It was about the bond that had formed between a human and a wild animal, a bond built on trust, compassion, and mutual respect. It was about the moment when the natural order of predator and prey had been suspended in favor of something deeper, something that spoke to the fundamental interconnectedness of all living things. 2 weeks after his ordeal, Marcus was conducting a routine patrol in the Lamar Valley when he spotted a familiar tawny form on a distant ridgeline. The male cougar stood silhouetted against the late afternoon sky, its powerful body unmistakable. Even from this distance, Marcus could make out the distinctive way it held its weight, favoring its left side slightly where the wound was still healing. The cougar turned its head, seeming to look directly at Marcus across the expanse of meadow and forest. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other. Then the cougar turned and disappeared over the ridge, moving back into the vast wilderness that was its home. Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The cougar was alive, still wild, still free. That was exactly as it should be. He continued his patrol, his boots crunching through the frost-touched grass, his eyes scanning the landscape he had dedicated his life to protecting. This encounter wasn't just a lucky coincidence or a miraculous fluke. It was a powerful, undeniable lesson that kindness offered without expectation is never truly forgotten. The male cougar remembered the human who had saved its life when it was young and vulnerable, and in turn had risked everything to save him. It affirmed something Marcus had always believed, but had never witnessed so dramatically. Empathy is a powerful survival tool, capable of forging alliances that transcend the boundaries of species. Animals, particularly intelligent predators like cougars, possess emotional complexity that humans often underestimate. They remember, they recognize patterns, they form attachments based on experience rather than instinct alone. Marcus would go on to share his story with the park's educational programs, though he always emphasized that his experience was exceptional and should never encourage people to approach or interact with wild predators. The story became a teaching tool about the importance of wildlife rehabilitation, about treating animals with compassion, and about respecting the intelligence and emotional lives of the creatures with whom we share this planet. Sarah Chen visited Yellowstone 3 months later, and Marcus took her to the spot on Specimen Ridge where everything had happened. The rope marks were still visible on the ponderosa pine's bark, a permanent reminder. Sarah listened to the story with tears in her eyes, understanding in a way few others could the profound nature of what had occurred. "That young cougar we saved," she said quietly, staring at the tree. "We gave it a second chance at life, and it gave you the same gift." Marcus nodded. "It's more than that, though. It proves that these animals aren't just biological machines operating on instinct. They think, they remember, they feel gratitude, they form bonds that can last years, even in the wild." They stood together in the quiet forest, surrounded by the ancient trees and the calls of birds, and felt the weight of that truth. The work they did as conservationists, as healers of injured wildlife, had meaning beyond the immediate act of saving a single animal. Every creature they helped had the potential to carry that compassion forward, to remember, to perhaps someday return the favor in ways unexpected and profound. As winter settled over Yellowstone that year, Marcus occasionally spotted the male cougar during his patrols, always from a distance, always with mutual acknowledgement, but appropriate separation. The animal had returned to its natural patterns, hunting the elk and deer that migrated through the valleys, maintaining its territory, living the life it was meant to live. But there was one moment in late December when Marcus encountered the cougar at twilight near the Yellowstone River. Fresh snow had fallen, muffling sound and transforming the landscape into a pristine winter wonderland. The cougar was drinking from the partially frozen river when Marcus approached on the trail above. It looked up, water dripping from its muzzle, and their eyes met across the distance. Neither moved. Neither felt the need to. They simply existed in that moment, two survivors bound by an experience that defied conventional understanding. Then the cougar turned and melted into the darkening forest, its tracks quickly being filled by falling snow. Marcus stood there as darkness fell, feeling grateful not just for his life but for the privilege of witnessing such a profound connection. In a world that often felt disconnected from nature, where humans increasingly lived separate from the wild places, this experience had reminded him why his work mattered. It had shown him that the boundaries we draw between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, are often more permeable than we imagine. The story of Marcus Reed and the cougar that saved him became something of a legend within the National Park Service, a tale passed among rangers and wildlife biologists, always with the caveat that such events were extraordinarily rare and should never be expected or pursued. But for those who heard it, the story served as a powerful reminder of the potential for interspecies connection, for the memory and emotional depth of wild animals, and for the unexpected ways that compassion can circle back when we least expect it. Marcus continued his work in Yellowstone for many years after that autumn morning on Speckenham Ridge. He saved countless other animals, always treating each one with the respect and care he had shown that young injured cougar so many months before. He never forgot that the small acts of kindness we extend into the world have ripples we cannot always predict or measure, and sometimes when he was alone in the wilderness, conducting surveys or tracking migration patterns, he would pause and scan the ridgelines, looking for that familiar tawny form. Most times he saw nothing, but occasionally he would catch a glimpse of the male cougar watching from a distance, a silent guardian, a reminder of the day when the natural order had been suspended in favor of something more powerful than instinct. That reminder carried Marcus through difficult days and bureaucratic frustrations, through budget cuts and political battles over land management. It reminded him that at the core of conservation work was a simple truth: all living things have value, all creatures possess an inner life worth respecting, and the connections we form with the natural world can sustain us in ways both practical and spiritual. The bond between Marcus and the male cougar was never tested again in such dramatic fashion. There were no more life-threatening encounters, no more desperate struggles for survival, but the connection remained, an invisible thread linking human and animal across the vast wilderness of Yellowstone. And that, Marcus came to understand, was the most profound lesson of all. The greatest acts of conservation aren't always about grand gestures or sweeping policy changes. Sometimes they're about a single moment of compassion extended to a frightened, injured animal. Sometimes they're about the quiet acknowledgement that we share this world with creatures who think, feel, and remember in ways we're only beginning to understand. Years later, when Marcus was training new rangers, he would sometimes tell them about that autumn morning, leaving out none of the details, the fear and the wonder and the impossible communication between species. He would watch their faces as the story unfolded, see the skepticism give way to amazement, and then he would tell them the most important part: the male cougar that saved me, he would say, didn't do it because I was special or because I had some magical connection with wildlife. It did it because I had shown it compassion when it was vulnerable without asking for anything in return. That's the foundation of everything we do here. We protect these animals not because they might someday save our lives, but because it's the right thing to do, because they deserve to exist in their wild spaces, free from exploitation and harm. And if we're very lucky, if we approach our work with humility and respect, sometimes the wilderness teaches us lessons we could never learn anywhere else. The young rangers would nod, some still processing the extraordinary nature of the story, others already understanding its deeper implication, and Marcus would send them out into the field, knowing that some would encounter their own moments of profound connection, their own lessons about the intelligence and emotional depth of the animals they were sworn to protect. The male cougar lived for several more years in Yellowstone's back country, a successful and formidable predator that contributed to the ecosystem's delicate balance. Park biologists occasionally documented it through camera traps and scat analysis, noting its health and territory range. And when it finally passed, as all wild things must, it did so in the manner of its kind, alone, in a quiet den, having lived a full life in the wilderness it called home. Marcus learned of its death through the Biological Monitoring Network, a routine report noting that the cougar with the distinctive shoulder scar had not been documented in over a year and was presumed deceased. He felt the news like a physical blow, even though he had known this day would come. Wild cougars in Yellowstone typically lived 8 to 13 years, and this one had exceeded those expectations. He hiked to the area where the cougar had last been documented, not expecting to find anything but needing to pay his respects in the only way he knew how. He stood on a windswept ridge, overlooking the Lamar Valley, the place where he had first spotted the young injured cougar all those years ago, and he spoke quietly to the empty air. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for remembering. Thank you for teaching me that the bonds we form with the natural world are real and lasting. Thank you for showing me that compassion has power beyond what we can measure or quantify." The wind carried his words away across the valley, across the forests and meadows where the cougar had lived and hunted and ultimately saved a human's life. And Marcus felt in that moment that somehow his gratitude had been received, acknowledged by the vast and ancient wilderness that surrounded him. He returned to his duties, to the endless work of protecting Yellowstone's incredible biodiversity, but he carried the memory of that cougar with him always. It informed every decision he made, every interaction with wildlife, every moment of wonder when he witnessed the complex social behaviors of the animals he studied. The story lived on too, told and retold by those who understood its significance. It appeared in academic papers about animal cognition and emotional intelligence. It was featured in documentaries about human-wildlife interaction. It inspired a new generation of biologists and conservationists to approach their work with greater appreciation for the inner lives of the creatures they studied. But for Marcus, the story was never about fame or recognition. It was a deeply personal reminder of a debt paid and a connection honored. It was proof that in a world that often felt increasingly disconnected from nature, moments of genuine interspecies understanding were still possible. It was affirmation that the work he had chosen, the life he had built in service to wild places and wild creatures, had meaning beyond what he could have imagined when he first became a ranger. As Marcus entered the later years of his career, he found himself reflecting more often on that autumn morning. The details remained vivid: the feeling of the rough rope cutting into his arms, the amber eyes of the cougar studying him with recognition, the sound of the wolf pack's howls echoing across the mountainside, the warm touch of fur beneath his grateful fingers. These memories became a touchstone for him, something to return to when the challenges of his work felt overwhelming. They reminded him why he had chosen this path, why he endured the long winters and the physical hardships and the heartbreak of witnessing habitat loss and poaching and all the ways humans harmed the natural world. The male cougar had given him more than his life that day. It had given him purpose, validation, and a story that would outlive them both. In the end, that's what mattered most. Not the dramatic rescue or the unlikely survival, but the lesson embedded within it, that kindness extended to even the most fearsome creatures can create bonds that transcend understanding, that the wild animals with whom we share this planet possess emotional and cognitive complexity deserving of our deepest respect, and that sometimes, in ways we cannot predict or control, the compassion we offer to the world returns to us when we need it most. Marcus Reed retired from the National Park Service many years later, his body worn by decades of hard work in challenging conditions, but his spirit still strong. He settled in a small cabin near the park's boundary, where he could still see the mountains he had spent his life protecting, and on clear autumn mornings when the light hit the ridgelines just right, he would sometimes imagine he saw a tawny form moving through the distant trees, a ghost or a memory, or perhaps just a trick of the light. But whether real or imagined, that vision always brought a smile to his face and a profound sense of gratitude to his heart. The male cougar had been his teacher, his savior, and ultimately, his reminder that the boundaries between human and animal, between wild and civilized, between predator and protector, are far more fluid than most people realize. And that lesson, Marcus knew, was worth more than all the awards and accolades he had received during his long career. It was the kind of wisdom that could only be earned through direct experience, through survival, through the meeting of eyes between species and the acknowledgement of shared existence. The wilderness had many lessons to teach, but this one, this profound understanding of interspecies connection and the power of remembered compassion, was perhaps the most important of all, and Marcus carried it with him, a bright flame of understanding and gratitude, until his own final days, when he too returned to the earth, enriching the soil of the wild places he had loved and protected for so long. The story, however, did not end with Marcus's passing. It continued to spread, shared by new generations of rangers and conservationists, adapted and retold in various forms, but always maintaining its essential truth, that a wild cougar recognized and saved the human who had once saved it. creating a bond that demonstrated the profound emotional and cognitive capabilities of wild animals. The story became part of Yellowstone's oral history, as much a part of the park's legacy as the geysers and the wolves and the vast herds of bison. It stood as testament to what was possible when humans approached wildlife with respect, compassion, and humility. It proved that the animals we share this planet with are not merely instinct-driven automatons, but thinking, feeling beings capable of memory, recognition, and perhaps even gratitude. And in a world that desperately needed reminders of our connection to nature, of the importance of protecting wild places and wild creatures, the story of Marcus Reed and the cougar that saved him served as a beacon of hope, a demonstration that the compassionate acts we extend into the world have ripples and consequences we cannot always foresee, and that sometime we most need it, the wilderness itself reaches back to protect and preserve those who have dedicated their lives to its protection. The legacy of that autumn morning on Speckman Ridge continued to inspire and educate, reminding each new generation that we are not separate from nature but an integral part of it, and that the bonds we form with the natural world can sustain and save us in ways both profound and unexpected. This story is more than just about survival. It's about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, and how sometimes they don't just share our lives, they save them.